Some of the things that really resonated me, Mark, with your paper on the Fellahin, is that how it's pronounced? Fellahin. Was some of the ways it really resonated with a lot of the writing on subaltern and indigenous politics, the focus of the Fellahin on the strong embeddedness upon and to land. And you're describing the sense of the living character of the land as sort of central to the politics of that movement. And also really resonant for me was the tracings of how the Fellahin have continued to live around the state projects that have sort of been operating from the Ottoman Empire through British modernization and the Zionist project, the attempts to continue to live as though they are sovereign, even in the context of this imperial control, because of their relationship to the land and the living land was really striking for me. And so I started thinking about this relationship of sustained political projects, such as the Fellahin, to the other papers on the Gezi uprising. And this raised some questions for me about what was similar and what was different around the relationship to the land, from this movement in Palestine to the post-2010 struggles in Turkey and also elsewhere around the globe. And initially we were thinking that the post-2010 protests are often celebrated as these movements of like young, urban, technologically sophisticated, educated youth. So there's often this idea of the graduate with no future, the smartphone-buried urban youth engaged in the occupations of squares, parks, urban space, whereas the Fellahin, as I understand in your description, are more connected to rurality, land, and food production. So the sort of overwhelmingly rural versus the overwhelmingly urban makeup of these two movements. And this sort of perceived divide between an urban and land-based struggle. So the first question that emerged for me was what the three of you make of this relationship between the rural and urban that appear in your papers, and what kinds of relationships between these two localities emerge, and how does the rural or urban impact prospects for social movements on both these really local scales and how they translate and then flow into the global. And I was also wondering if you could speak a bit about the role of like rural flight, what role that might play in Turkey if there is a movement off the land and into urban centers, and how that might be impacting sort of the uprisings, how that impacted uprisings in Gezi and the later outcomes of that, and whether or not, Mark, there's kind of a rural flight that exists amongst the Fellahin, if there is a movement off the land and into urban centers, and if the sort of big tendencies of increasing urbanization across the globe are impacting the Fellahin political project and its future prospects. So continuing with the question of land and place in relationship to social struggles, I was also drawn to the strong critique of nationalism amongst the Fellahin and the critique of sort of even leadership of Palestinian movements and the building of alternative state projects, and how that really ran up against this embodied sense that the land itself cannot be owned or bordered. And yeah, you talked about the Fellahin sense of land as unownable, as living, and that this relationship, that land is something that can't be possessed, that runs through their political project. So this kind of different relationship to land that formulates their political project. And I thought this refusal of nationalism potentially tied to land and space and place was also really present in your papers on the Gezi uprising. That as these movements spread across the country, they also rejected the sort of nationalist aims of the Turkish government, the narrow nationalist politics of an imperial nationalism of Erdogan. And so together with this question of an urban-rural divide centered on a relationship to land, I was wondering if you could speak to the specificities of a contra-nationalist politics. And maybe kind of, I was thinking how that related to what Hamid Dabashi was saying last night about this separation of nation state, and the separation of nation and state. And so in Turkey in particular, how much of the Gezi protests' refusal of a nationalist imperialism was connected to people's relationship to place and space, to the city or to their land. And I was wondering if you could articulate a little more what the Gezi protesters imagined as the relationship to land, and if there was one. It seemed that there was, because you talked about this, where Mark, in reference to the Fellahin, talked about Fellahin. sorry, talked about the living sense of land. In the Gezi protests, you talked about the living sense of land too, and the trees as a living part of protests, and even this like non-human or other than human in the way animals and penguins became this actor, mostly for comedic effect, but became this actor in the demonstrations. So maybe you could speak about this relationship to land alongside a rejection of nationalism. And the question of embodiment also really resonated in all of your papers, I thought, the way that there was some sort of communal reproduction of life operating in all of these movements and uprisings, in the urban mobilizations in Gezi and in the more rural movements of the Fellahin. And also in these movements, the way there's this interdependency of people and a bodily obligation to participate, the sort of care work that you are talking about, Oznur. So in all of these, I think we see this relationship to non-human life, to land, to creative capacities, to care and culture as threads that flow through all of your papers. And I'm wondering how these threads also contribute to constituting a decolonial alternative mode of life or mode of politics. Yeah, and then again, sort of sticking with somewhat of the topic of land, it struck me the differences between the uprisings of the post-2010 movements, including in Gezi, and Mark's work on the Fellahin, was the longevity, I guess, or how these movements were sustained and whether or not they were sustained. So the post-2010 movements have kind of appeared as these sparks and been seemingly fairly ephemeral and spectacular, and in some cases disappear as quickly as they emerge, are easily dispersed and crushed, whereas the Fellahin seem to be a little less spectacular, certainly less well known, and have been sustained for generations upon generations. And I'm wondering what constitutes this. Is it a relationship to land and the everydayness of struggle that is part of Fellahin life and resistance? And whether or not in the uprising, the post-2010 uprisings, the Gezi movement, there was a rejection of everydayness. It appeared like there was this rejection of everydayness, a break with the everyday, whereas the everydayness seems to be embedded in part of the Fellahin struggle. And then connected to that, it just got me thinking too about, I mean, that's one thing I'm definitely curious about, is what contributes to the longevity, vitality, and viability of struggle. And so in reference to that, what do you think has been the outcome of the protests in Turkey, the Gezi protests, in light of the current political terrain, obviously? Does the Gezi moment live on? Has it impacted things in the current moment of repression? And although perhaps these post-2010 uprisings might not possess the same longevity of sustained struggle, do you think spectacular protest or these temporary uprisings change the sense of what is possible for people, even in their everydayness? And how does that impact the politics of the future? And then, of course, there's also the question of media and the modes of communication that also ran through all of your papers. Again, even though the Fellahin was positioned as this more land-based and rural movement, their modes of protest in the present are very mediatized and media savvy, and they're constructed to reach out across global space and to make connections with people and places beyond themselves in the tradition, of course, of other land-based and rural and sort of peripheral movements like the Zapatistas, which really brings out, I think, some of the finer points of this idea of a global assemblage and its relationship to others, to relations of exteriority, as Deleuze and Guattari talk about it. So there is this tension or relationship in all the papers between locally specific and place-based context embedded in the character of these movements, and then their simultaneous claims towards or reaching for globality and global connection. And all of you talk about the ways in which these aims towards globality and a movement beyond the local happens through cultural production, mostly, right? So the Avatar movie, the use of humor and sort of popular symbols of popular culture, and of course social media technology. So there isn't, in this aim for globality, there isn't an attempt to build a fifth international, but rather to build some global connection through art, film, humor, even discourse, as opposed to perhaps these more, as opposed to more sort of concretized or traditional forms of political organization. So I'm curious to know what you think about the relationship of art or media to the spectacular elements of politics, and then also to the less spectacular elements of politics. So how does a more mediatized or globally communicative driven approach advance your specific struggles that you're writing about? And then, because this is something I'm always curious about and often thinking critically about, is how much the spectacular sort of mediatized approach is necessary to politics. Is it a necessary strategic move or a short-lived tactical expression? Can you connect these issues of embodiment in and through technological mediation, which is something you talked about, Oznur, with the issues of land, space, and place that we mentioned, that I talked about earlier? And then finally, connected to that broader question, is about the issue of the sort of rejection of more traditional forms of state-based politics and more traditional forms of radical and revolutionary political organizations. As I think in your paper, Gul, you talked about the inherent unpredictability of the movements in Gezi, and which is a common theme throughout a lot of the post-2010 assemblage type organizing, and of course is inherent to Deleuze and Guattari's notion of assemblages, right? The way things hang together in difference, that there's no idea of wholes, it's about multiplicities, there's no logic of unity or sameness. So what does that mean for sustained political organizing? Does it point to a refusal of more traditional political concepts of struggle and of resistance and of revolution? And how does this mesh with the contemporary politics of a very networked, connected, and the contemporary logics of digital technology and a digitized capitalism? And how does that mesh with the temporality set by this like high-speed, fast-paced capitalism? Are these movements, there's definitely a different tension in temporality in the two locations you're talking about, in Palestine and in Turkey. So yeah, I guess what kind of political organization best meets the needs of struggle today? I had a couple more things here. Yeah, one of the other things I was thinking about, and I haven't really put this into clearly coherent question yet, but having looked a lot at Deleuze and Guattari's work and considered the idea of assemblage for quite some time, one of the things that really strikes me as important and powerful about it for politics is this idea of it being, as Manuel de Landa says, a wide variety of wholes constructed from heterogeneous parts, and the way it describes how multiplicities can exist within larger entities without succumbing to this logic of unity or sameness. And Deleuze says that assemblages are a collection of co-functioning heterogeneous parts that form provisional wholes that remain forever open and never form a totality. And this is interesting, I think, because it does seem to describe something that's happening in current political manifestations and uprisings. But I also see this massive difference here in what's happening with the Felhin in comparison to Gezi. And primarily I see this question emerging of what it is that holds heterogeneous parts together, and what it is that, if they're held together or not, how that contributes to the sort of longevity and viability of politics that will allow us, for lack of a better word, to win. So, you know, what is it that holds post-2010 movements together, the Gezi struggle together? There was this rejection of nationalism in Turkey, and also this rejection of, you know, we are all united as Turkish people because of the role the Kurds played in struggle and other identities, cultural identities. Whereas it seems like the Fellahin share this sense of cultural identity, cultural memory, history, and location on the land. So I guess what would it mean, I think, or what do we need to think about enacting long-term, sustainable, viable political projects that incorporate this difference, but that are neither populist nor short-lived? I guess that's my question.
When I first moved to Canada and would be exposed to activism and protests here, I'm not going to lie, I'm just going to put my biases, as I mentioned to Margot earlier, my biases out in the open. I didn't think much of them. Having grown up in the Intifada, I thought, oh, there's no soldiers or tanks, and what's the risk in this? So what's what's this accomplishing? Which is the wrong view, but you know, that was the kind of the bias that I had for the longest time. So I really only became interested in the academic world around social movement and protest only after the Arab uprisings of 2011. Previous to that, I have just been interested in sort of a theoretical understanding of the violence in the region, and what that means to notions of Palestine, of the very concepts of Palestine and Israel themselves. So as I sort of got more into this, I began to see that a lot of the material in the social movement literature didn't quite speak to my personal experiences or to my ability to understand what is happening in Palestine. So I was always drawn to what is called post-structural thinking, which is, I agree with Spivak, who coined it, is a useless term. But regardless, I was already drawn to Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and Derrida and others as well as decolonial authors like Fanon and Said and Memi and so on, and Césaire. And in a sense, I see assemblage and the way that I'm trying to use it in this paper as a way that allows me to speak of this enormous history of Palestinian resistance, which I'm only, you know, trying to touch a very small, tiny piece of in this paper. But to try to speak about it in a kind of a more open way that doesn't tie me to restrict definitions of what a social movement ought to look like and what you know, political system it ought to emerge in, or any of those kinds of rules, I guess. So I'm trying to capture, I guess, in general, and I'll just start with the general, and then let my colleagues here speak, and then we can go back to some of the specific points. In general, I'm trying to capture how, if you view Fellahin resistance as an assemblage, how that in itself becomes a kind of that matter movement or matter flow that Deleuze and Guattari talk about, out of which certain discontinuities to the matter movement or matter flow emerge. So in a sense, how I understand this notion of matter movement or matter flow is this kind of Benjaminian mysterious side of the mysterious point of view, where it is a kind of something that can't actually be ever known or seen directly, but you kind of know it by the discontinuities that emerge out of that flow. And I'm just trying to pick out a couple of spots along this long history where I see certain important modes of decolonial resistance happening, and trying to understand how, you know, when I see, for example, the resistance of the villagers in Belain, it just speaks to me of this longer history of how the Fellahin understood resistance, which is very different than what, you know, PA, the Palestinian Authority, is just too easy to pick on as something that is very different from what the Fellahin, how the Fellahin understand resistance, but even very different from urban-based resistors who have good views and solid methods of resistance. But there is something different about the Fellahin. You know, and it's not an abstract concept for me. These are people that I grew up with. I have specific people's faces when I think about, these modes of resistance of people who, and this is touching on some other themes, the sustainability and the viability and longevity, and it's people who don't even think about those questions because they don't apply. They don't resist because they have a plan that they're following. They resist because they have to. There's no other thing to do but to resist. You don't have to think about longevity. Longevity is guaranteed by the occupation. As long as the occupation stays, the resistance keeps going. It's not going to be a matter of how, but there are other important questions within that we can touch on. So I'll just leave it at this general level to begin with, and then maybe get into some of the more specific details as we move along.
What drew me to this particular Gezi Park event is after Arab Spring, was the very ephemerality of those moments. But are they really ephemeral? Like, that's what I wanted to understand. Just personal anecdote to that. When Gezi Park events were happening, I was in Toronto and packing to move to Fredericton because I got the job that summer. And then I was like glued to internet and, all the news and social media, trying to understand what's going on. And what struck me was the humor and the symbols, how they are mobilizing people. But I was also aware that even though it seemed like this celebratory urban ephemeral-looking movement was shared through internet, through social media, it was very substantial. It was happening on the ground, in the everyday, on the streets, at the squares. It was happening in everyday lives of people. So, and then the following summer, I went to Turkey, did 32 interviews, both in Ankara and Istanbul, which both urban interviews there. I think Oznur can talk about your more rural accounts, not rural, but more eastern accounts of it. I had the chance to understand this sustainability of it. Like, was it really ephemeral? What sustained, and it's almost like articulation of this resistance in these halls, but when it is over, what remains? Is it still the hall as big as it was before, or is it narrower? So my interviews mostly were the long-time activists who were participated in the resistance movement as well. So their stories of activism, their Gezis, I wanted to understand, and what has changed for them and for their movements, for their understanding of this very urban, unexpected resistance that has happened all through Turkey. So that's, and also, what is the premise? What's the future? And to my surprise, there were dozens of books already published the next summer, like within the 2 months after the, like there is that inflation of publications, but not much really, not to devalue them, because I think if nothing else, they at least archived what has happened, right? So it was capturing what has happened. So, but all the talks I had with the host of activists, they said, we need time to think about this, what has just happened, and how it will impact us, our movement, our future, where we are going with this. And we are very aware that it was, spectacular. But we were here before, and we were here during, and we will be here after, and how it's impacted us. So that was one of the main questions that I will be writing about when I come back to these interviews. And in terms of longevity, I think that is how we assemblage, the notion of assemblage gives us tools to understand longevity differently too, because we can then understand what do we mean by longevity and what kind of time, temporality we are talking about, right? So I think in that framework, it's significant. The other striking thing about longevity and the spectacularness of Gezi was that the very thing that activists were there before, they were there during and after. They were the ones who did all the guerrilla fighting, all the barricade building. They had the tools and history to do that. So they brought that longevity, long-built skills to the scene, right? But also there was that long history of different minority groups in Turkey that they have these cumulative history of activism, right? Kurds, there were Armenians, there were Alevis, Kurds, and Armenians. They were the front runners of the ground movement. So, so our understanding of longevity and ephemerality, I think, we should challenge that, how we understand when we think about them. Also, Kurds were saying, and Alevis too, and Armenians too, we have been fighting for decades. This became spectacular and so visible. But Kurds were laughing at, we have been doing this fight day in and day out with police, with tear gas, with tanks for decades. So, but this is all of a sudden something celebrated. So there's that critique to it too. That's why I appreciate your look at that, and that suspicion, almost like this, what just has happened and what remained. And this suspicion, I think, we can validate it when we look at what has happened post and what's happening right now in Turkey, when we look at that, right? What has accomplished, and it only outraged the Erdogan, the Sultan, right? So, and then things escalated after that. But I know you can speak to that as well. So I don't want to go into great length in that further, but one more thing I wanted to, social media. So use of social media, even though these symbols and humor, and I argue it was one of the glues that hold the movement together, on the ground events together. It was one of the glues. The other one was very structural, and it was the bodies of people, and you talk about that. They were captured through digital media, but they happened on the ground. They happened on the streets. They happened on the walls of the buildings. So it was not all digital. Maybe it was captured digitally, and it was like digital capturing or digital activism of it was, I'm very, in a way, critical of understanding these kind of languages being shared, or the role of digital media. And I think it's exaggerated in these moments, and still structure and bodily existence is very important, but it is a significant tool to mobilize also, and to document also. So social media has a great role in capturing that, but it still happened everydayness and embodied experiences, I would say. I think I will stop here and pass the...
Thank you. Starting from the division between rural and urban is kind of starting from the division of rural and urban is kind of challenging. No, not at all. Okay. But thanks from starting from there and going back to the other aspects. So what I would say is that, yeah, I mean, from my practical point of view, of course it was a very urban movement, but then at the same time, for some years, there was this rural protests against hydraulic power plants going on in the northern part of Turkey. And there was this communication, always the activists in the rural parts of Turkey were always sending their solidarity messages. And they didn't come to the square and to be there, but they did that. And afterwards, I think what I have seen is also, years later, nowadays, the post-Gezi protesters are also involved in cooperatives, they are trying to bring food from the affected areas, northern part of Turkey, and making a direct commerce between them, and more or less this is the connection between the rural parts and the more urban. But I think the understanding of space in itself was against the division of rural and urban in what sense, and I think this is the part which can be related to your presentation, how the way we relate to the space itself was beyond the division of urban and rural. It was like in the performative level in Gezi, but the first thing the activists did was to make a garden. And they didn't even have a chance, they didn't even have a chance to eat food from there, but like symbolically it was something, like to say that, okay, we are here. Like this is my space now. And also I think this is also what I do, basically the infrastructural requirements, like food, eating, and like making a space in that sense were quite important. And I think it points to a different understanding of space, which cannot be divided into rural and urban. That's what the only thing I can say about this, but of course, like, it is a tricky point, I know. And also this nationality thing, the contra-nationalistic projects and against the nation states, and a different sense of land. And I think it became on the road in Gezi. The contra-nationalistic approach was not there from the beginning. I mean, like everything. Like Gezi was always in the making, and the identity of Gezi was always in the making. So at the beginning, there was like the larger crowds were nationalistic and the Republican crowds. This is also what is interesting for me. So, but in time, during Gezi, certain discourses, certain values, and certain practices and protest types are adapted by all the protesters, including the nationalistic ones. And then they turned into something else, translated into a different type of protests. So what is interesting in Gezi was that although the majority was coming from the nationalistic and the Republican Party populations, they adapted to practices that were coming from autonomous movements, which is quite interesting. So assembly was adapted, was selected, picked, and then it was always there later on. The assembly type of decision making, and also very practical, very also bodily practices like earth meals. Earth meal is a type of protest. It is basically eating in a communal space in Ramadan. And it was started by anti-capitalist Muslims 2 years before Gezi. And also they made it in Gezi. And basically what they were doing, they were just gathering together in parks close to the luxurious hotels where the government was organizing the very opulent Ramadan dinners, and they were just sharing food and eating there. And this practice, interestingly, became a part of the Gezi repertoire, and it was always there. And also even the very secular neighborhood assemblies, they did that, and they adapted it. And everyone was there participating, sharing food under very humble conditions. So what is interesting is that nationalism is also something like this. So people came there as nationalist Turkish citizens, but then they became something else. And nationalism couldn't survive, racism couldn't survive. And also one of the most important aspects, movements of Gezi was after Medeni was killed in Kurdistan. They were at the same time, as always, resisting the construction of police stations in Kurdistan. We were in the peace process. So they were protesting against it, and they were asking, if we are making peace, why are you continuing to construct the police stations, which they were right. And then when he was killed, he was adopted in Gezi by the Gezi protesters, nationalists and others. He was also considered as one of the martyrs of Gezi, and there were protests also in the western part of Turkey, which is something new. This is one of the novelty in Turkey. So I think this happened as part of the very encounters in Gezi. It wasn't planified, and most of the people were actually nationalists. So that's the way I see the contra-nationalist movement. So it became on the road, and somehow it couldn't survive. And the very nationalist organizations like the Workers' Party, it's kind of weird, but the Workers' Party back then was a very nationalist party. Not at the beginning, but nowadays it is, but then it turned into something else these days. So they were quite against it, and in the assemblies right after the protest, they came there and they wanted to talk only about this and saying things like, okay, Öcalan is a baby killer, whatever, all the things that we have been seeing. But then the more ordinary and non-politicized people in the assembly didn't let it happen. What they did was, one came out and said, okay, I have been hearing this like throughout my life. I want to hear something else. So let this Kurdish boy speak out, and I want to hear what he says, because I'm really tired of, I come from a Kemalist, nationalist family, and I'm tired of hearing the same thing again and again. I want to see and hear something else. So this was the atmosphere in Gezi and assemblies. They couldn't hold on for some reason. And also, yeah, I think like the space making and the different understanding of space, which goes beyond the division of rural and urban, comes from the understanding of like the commune. Taksim was started to be called a commune from the very beginning. And people were always saying, I'm also analyzing the assembly notes, and most of the time people refer to it as the life space. And also the Taksim Solidarity, which was more or less the loose organizational entity of Gezi Park, they also refer to it as the defense of a life space. So there was this understanding of a life space that was supposed to be defended against the plunder of the gentrification projects of the government. And this is this communal way of life and interdependency coming from it. They were always saying, and also this is like one of the tracks that I'm trying to analyze, they kept saying, okay, like we understood that we all needed one another. Okay, so we don't like them, I know, but we need them. So we are strong here because we have them at the same time. So like the understanding of, okay, we need each other and we have to be, and also like you are under the conditions of like very bodily vulnerability. So you can be hurt, you can be hit by a plastic can and everything, and it happens all the time. So you are also very physically dependent on the others. And the Gezi atmosphere was always like there is this carnival-like life going on in Gezi, but clashes with the police all around. So like there was this groups of people going to the clash, like the fronts, and coming back injured, and the doctors, voluntary doctors, helping them all at the same time. So it was also a kind of like a situation that called for interdependency, because. And also you have no means, no regular and ordinary means to help each other. So we had to create our own means to take care of one another. And the sustainability question is also like, it comes out all the time. And I think like also, like as you said, like behind this, so why the practices of autonomous left was adapted. And why assemblies, so why earth mills, why not the nationalist ways of protest types. So I think this comes from a certain tradition that found the means to express itself. For instance, the anarchists, that's what they say. They say, okay, this is our way of making things, and people saw that it works for some reason under the practical conditions. And I think it's also like a different understanding of time and temporality. I'm also analyzing like the heritage of Gezi, what the activists themselves think about their past. And it goes to, like for Muslims, it goes to the Medina contract. Yeah. And for others, like more leftist people, it goes to Paris Commune. So in one way or another, Paris Commune was there. Medina contract was there. Also like, and so I see that also assemblage theory is a good way to think about such type of temporality, like poor past as the rituality. So I think that's also a way to understand the novelty and the surprise of the movement. So like, they were always active, both in the imaginary of the people, and also the Gezi Park itself comes from this imaginary. When I read your paper, I was thinking about this. Like Turkey is also a state which was based on like huge, like depopulation of huge communities, Armenians, like based on genocide and blood. So it was also like a territory that was emptied out, like it was made into a place. In that sense, in your words. So I was thinking about this, for instance, for Armenians in Gezi, when they participated in that, there's an organization called Norzartung. They want self-sufficiency and autonomy in Turkey, and it's a response to the Kurdish movement's demand of autonomy. So they are like always in solidarity with the Kurdish movement, and they want autonomy. What was interesting is that what they were saying, Gezi Park was before a cemetery, Armenian cemetery, and established and Gezi Park was one of the symbols of the new Republican Turkey. And then, like, it's very interesting, and it was based on the erasal of the Armenian past, and they couldn't do that, but they are trying to do that still. And nowadays, the neo-Ottoman project of Erdogan was to go back to the older imaginary, like also erase the Kemalist imaginary of represented by Gezi Park. What was interesting is that the Armenians from North Zartung, what they were saying is that, okay, you took it away from us once, but we will not let it happen again. So like the old, like the poor past, like the virtual domain is always active there. And also I think like the sustainability, it goes on in some way or another. And I think it's also the relationship with the other movements. I mean, like we take certain, also assembly form, for instance, for us comes from Greece and also from Spain. Mostly Greece because we are like very much close to Greece and we have a certain memory of it. The activists who started the Park Watch were coming from the like anarchist and urban activist background. They knew about the European ways of like the European uprisings, resident uprising, and they had this memory and they introduced it to the park itself. So in one way or another, like 15M was there, like the Koti Park was there, and even like the Medina contract was there, and they lived there. And I think the sustainability was like in those movements, they created certain interstices, like in terms of also like strangers maybe. It's just a way, like I think like the difference between Falahin movements and that Occupy movements was that they are more closer to the deterritorialization rank, although you have managed to re-territorialize and create a more like ongoing daily life there. Ours was just like a performance of it, and like a movement which was like a hit, which was closer to the territorialization. That was why like all the new encounters came together and happened. And I think yours was more close to maybe Kurdish movements and what's going on in the Kurdish region, in the rural parts and also in the urban setting. Yeah. Do I have time?
Take another minute or two if you need it.
Yeah, just like the thing about social media and globality and place specificity. So I mean, if we see this place specificity and globality like this, what I see is that like certain practices are translated. It is not the same. The assemblies in Turkey are not the same. No one can imagine an earth meal happening in Europe because it's something quite Turkish, which comes from like Ramadan and everything. And globality comes from the translation of certain practices, like assembly making, like the making of space and the importance of making of space. And the emphasis on social media is like, of course, it is like, it's just fancy, I think. It's just popular to think about like all hashtags and all Twitter. But what I do, for instance, is just to see the problematic at hand. So why people use them? It's like very simple. So I look in the assembly notes, why, and at what point people apply to social media. And it always comes from a concern to be more accessible. So in all the assemblies, what they say is that, okay, we need to access to more people. We need to, they need to come, they need to understand. So what do we do? Okay, social media, Facebook, but not everyone has it. So what else do? We visit them. So offline and online means always come together. And also there is a huge infrastructural problem. So when I talk to activists, what they were telling me is that it's difficult. Like you cannot recharge your phone. So like why do they do Casas and all the others don't think about such things, like because it's not so like fancy maybe, like people looking for a like charger, or also there was this like hotels around Gezi Park which were like open, which had to be more or less open, and people were going there to charge. And also the internet, the Wi-Fi, people were putting pressure on the Starbucks around Taksim Park just to have access to internet. So there was a struggle going on also at a very material level. So internet was not coming from sky, or like it wasn't it's a natural resource in one way or another. It can be like water, but it is not. So they were struggling to have it, and they put pressure on Turkcell, one of the companies in Turkey, and they forced them to bring base stations in the square, and they did that. Yeah, I mean, like that's the way I try to see internet, and as a practice. So how do we practice it? And always for me, everything starts with a problem. So what is our problem at hand? So what do we do? And we have different solutions which are translated into different contexts. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you all for all of those wonderful comments and questions. Okay, I'll try my best to try to get through. Maybe I'll try to just tie them all together in one go. Okay, here goes. Assemblage at work right now. So to start with the urban versus rural, this is kind of my Tillian side context. Context is what matters on that question. So even in the case of the Fallahin, how that relationship between the urban and the rural played out in the 1920s and 1930s is very different from how it's playing now. And it's not just me who's not living that lifestyle anymore. I was part of that's kind of the direction that it's going into. It's also a lifestyle that is going away precisely because of specific strategic Israeli plans to eradicate that lifestyle. As Dumani mentions, it was the Fallahin that bought their lands, somehow, some way, scrapped the resources to put it together and bought those lands, are the areas where Palestine is recognized as belonging to Palestinians today. The West Bank, the Galilee, where you have the largest Palestinian-Israeli population. So, the Israeli government completely understands that is how, that is their actual opponent. There is a stark distinction between the Fallahin way of life and their claim to the land versus the Zionist claim to the land. Whereas the Palestinian Authority has just the mirror image of their claim to the land, and they know they're always going to win that fight. The Israelis are not afraid of the Palestinian Authority because they're helping them with their settler colonial project. To oversimplify, so I just want to now. I like the idea of viewing these. Sonia's gone. The 2008 or 2010, whatever year we want to give it, as something that is triggering our thinking about assemblage as opposed to the other way around, and to understand that people's practices of resistance have always led the way. Academics come second. I am of that view. And to tie that into perhaps the question of what holds heterogeneous parts together, and Margo, I'm not ignoring your question, I'll come back to that. What holds heterogeneous parts together? My view on that is always that it's kind of, the glue is kind of magical. That holds these things together. Meaning it's real, but it's also very precarious. But you also don't need a heck of a lot. I don't think that you need a heck of a lot in common to put together heterogeneous groups. And we see examples of that all over the place. We see examples of that in the Fallahin resistance that I'm talking about. In that small village of Silwan, my mother always reminds my father, she's from the family that lived halfway up the hill, which is much better than the people, my father's family who live on the bottom of the hill. So she's a better Silwani than he is, right? So there's all sorts of heterogeneous elements within the Fallahin resistance that I'm talking about. Yet they're held together by their shared experience that they have a different notion and understanding of land that is being not just threatened, but is actually being destroyed. That it is and has been destroyed. And then when you start to think about, for example, the ties between the heterogeneous experiences of Palestinians in general. I mean, a Palestinian Israeli citizen who lives in the Galilee has a lot of different worldviews, spatial and temporal configurations, to go back to Hamid's first question on the question of temporality. Right? Their very temporal understanding of 1948, the ways in which they orient themselves to 1948, a Palestinian living in the Galilee, is going to be entirely different from the Palestinians living in Lebanon, in the refugee camps. Entirely different. Versus the Palestinian born in Chile, where there is a huge Palestinian population, versus the Palestinian born in Saudi Arabia, versus the Palestinian born in Silwan, and on and on. Oh, wow, okay, all right. So there are various spatial and temporal dimensions at play in all of these heterogeneities. But again, I think as academics, we sometimes tend to think, oh my God, we need this complex, a huge list of commonalities that we all need to agree on 100% in order to form a whole. I don't think so. I think people have done this with very little. And I think then to bring this up to this larger global assemblage, as the activist from Belain who calls it global intifada. And it's funny how activist appears in my paper when we get to Balain, because they know the language. Even though they're Falahin, they know the language that you want to hear when you interview them. They'll tell you I'm an activist because they know that that's what you want to hear. They have goals when you're interviewing them. They understand. They understand their situation. They understand the global politics sometimes better than we do. At any rate, I kind of lost my train of thought. Okay, right. And I think the question of these global assemblages or global intifadas is the notion of decoloniality. I think that is the battle of our times, from my perspective. I think that is the biggest connection that all of these heterogeneous movements have in common. And that decoloniality is tied to land. It's so tied to land. But not land as we understand it in the political economy of capitalism or within the nation state. It's opposed to that. And it's that opposition to it that provides some shared commonality. But there are differences between the different indigenous communities on how you then understand it differently. We shouldn't downplay that. But I can't lose the point. But just very, half a minute. To tie that back, women have been at the forefront of Palestinian organizing from the beginning of resistance. I know it doesn't show up in my paper, but I am, I'm very aware of it. It's one of those things where. To just bring it to that last point that I mentioned, I had the pleasure and honor of meeting Madonna Thunderhawk, who's in Standing Rock as we speak, last year. And I remember, her and I got along immediately. And I just remember thinking, I haven't met someone like her since I left Palestine. She reminded me immediately of the women that I grew up with, and the fighters and the resistors that I grew up with. And I don't know how to describe it yet. I'm working on it, but I don't know how to describe what is distinctive about that. I'll just end it at that. Sorry.
Okay.
Try to take 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. I will try not to repeat a lot of things that I have agreed on. But I want to highlight one thing, couple things. That multiplicity and heterogeneity in connection with temporality and specialities. Heterogeneity, like the way Oznur, you described the park and how it was layered and layered of erasures, right? And then reclamations. So that reminded me of Janet's comment yesterday in Occupy movement, how indigenous people reminded us different histories of occupation that has happened. So it has happened at Gezi as well, in terms of Armenians claiming their parks, reminding us that you took away our cemetery, but you cannot take our park. So that those stories and history came to the park. And I think in terms of heterogeneity and moving together, in this moment, and maybe in all post 2008 or 2006 movements, as you were saying too, it's decolonial maybe. It is also, as Manisha was saying, it is, we now start hearing them, right? So at Gezi also, even though masses of people were moving and resisting, they were also dialoguing, hearing one another. Different groups came there with their own histories and claims, and they made claims, stakes to the space, Gezi Park, or the city they live in, or their struggles. So in that way, there was a lot of dialogue going on between groups, among groups, women. And when I talked to protesters, not only activists, but also protesters too, they said, feminists were saying, this was a very feminine movement. And then I was talking to LGBTQ activists. They were saying it was a very gay movement. So they saw themselves, the characteristics of their histories, stories, and struggles in this moment. So there was that dialogue going on amongst themselves. I mentioned somewhere in the paper, they even had workshops at the park to come up with swear words that will not offend anybody, you know? Like, how can we swear about this too, you know? And then, you know, and then they were stopping each other, you know, don't use fag, you know, they were just saying, you know, like, shh, there are gay people here, don't, you know, that's kind of, and at the end of it all, these movements, his stories became visible, heard, and known, and if nothing else, that remained from Gezi. Now my mom knows LGBT, you know, LGBT people. My mom talks about, you know, it was so, not to, you know, look down on what my mom knows already, but it became everyday language, everyday understanding. I think that has changed. Accepted or not? Did it erase nationalism? Did it erase racism? I don't think so. But what it did, it created space for tension, to question those things. I think that has happened at Gezi. It was able, the dialogue, and not easy dialogues happened. It was hard dialogue, like it was contentious. It was, you know, realizing that their own privileges maybe. That has happened. Did it resolve? I don't know. Something has changed though. And here, that's hearing happened. Like they heard. No one says now, I never heard that before, or I don't know that. So that has happened. I think that remained with people. What they do with them, ordinary people or not, up to them now. Right, so, okay.
Yeah, it's your question. I think like, the context is kind of different. I don't know I don't know exactly what you mean when you say like the assemblies were like very white, like there was this white supremacy in the assemblies which prevented. So I need to know more about that for one thing. And I think also the problem of like the context of like the tensions between autonomous movements and the indigenous movements, it is kind of different. So in Turkey, of course, like the Kurds also even us, like we name ourselves as indigenous, as an act of solidarity, and also like Kurds are also talking about the conditions of colonization, and they were actually colonized, but it's not the same type of process. So when I say autonomous movements, I just refer to the like post 1980, post coup d'etat conditions. Like in those conditions, we had these movements that were not political parties, that were like which had more micro agendas, which include, in my opinion, like the feminist movement, like women's movement, anarchist movement, urban movement. So when I say autonomous, like it is like a terminology which is basically used in Spain also to name those movements which have different organizational structures, which are like loose organizational structures, which try to use certain like measures to ensure horizontality and accessibility. So we had this after 80s, we had this huge network, especially in Istanbul, Ankara, big cities. So what I said, like, and also I don't see a causal relationship between like, okay, it is true that the practices of autonomous movements were adapted by the great majority of Gezi, but I cannot say that it is because of this that nationalism cannot survive or could not survive. I see it more in the like everyday contact. So people were always in contact with each other, and it was by no means without tensions. And I also try to analyze basically the contradictions and tensions. So like the Kurdish people, like the tents of the Kurds, the Kurdish movement were protected all the time by the leftists, like people coming from the leftist political parties. There were human chains around them, and when we were marching also, there were always tensions, and people were trying to we were making human chains around them so that nothing happened to them. So like there was always tensions, but it was sorted out somehow. Like the solutions were always found. And I think like this openness was more like people saw themselves part of something greater than themselves and their own organizations. Like even the very like Marxist, Leninist political organizations that claimed to predict it, and I talked to them, they say, oh, we predicted it, we knew that it would happen. So even what they were saying and what they were trying was, okay, we try to step backwards. Even during the assemblies, like those political parties like in Argentina, like they tried to have more word, but I think the assembly format, like the assembly making, protected somehow the community itself. I don't know the situation here, but especially in Turkey, I participated in a lot of assemblies in different cities and even in Germany. And in Germany, for instance, the nationalists were the majority, and they didn't change because they didn't live together. That's my opinion. It's just like hypothesis. Because they didn't see the contact, they didn't share food, they were not there. I think that's the reason. That must be the reason. And also people being there, like thinking that, okay, this is beyond us. This is beyond my organization. This is beyond me, like as an individual. I don't even know what's going on. Most of them were saying that. Apart from the very like Marxist-Leninists who know the subjects, who know it all. Even they were always like, okay, we have to step backwards. We have to let the people speak because it's a social movement and that's how it's supposed to be. I think that's why, basically, and people were, I mean, even just like, from a Trotskyist organization, there is this woman, she says there's like this thing, like you could tell everything to everyone easily. The people would listen to you. Like, for instance, you could talk about Armenian genocide with a colleague. Under normal conditions, it's impossible. Like, you cannot talk about Kurdish problem. Like, you fight. Like, especially in Turkey, it's like this. You cannot even say Armenian genocide. It's like prohibited. But like what she says is also, so like people, you could talk. Yes. And they were also happy to be listened because they were always like more marginalized. Okay, they are the revolutionaries, they do their own stuff. But there, also that's why, what the feminists say. They were, okay, we have always been marginalized up until now, but now we can talk to them and they listen to us and they come to us, like a football fan, coming from a very sexist tradition, comes to a feminist and asks, oh, can we swear like this? Like, is it okay? So what do you think? So there was this atmosphere, and I think it came from making a space together. And for instance, like in Germany, we didn't have that, and they stayed nationalists, and they were nationalists all the time. But when we had the experience of living together, we had this also experience of like being someone else, basically, or being open to be someone else. Mm-hmm.